Hello and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Edward W. de Barbieri, Associate Professor of Law at Albany Law School. We will discuss his draft article, Opportunism Zones. So welcome to the show, Ted.
Thanks, Brian. Great to be here.
Awesome. Well, so I really found this article interesting and timely, and it touched on a subject that I'd only heard about in passing. So for listeners who, like me, who might not be familiar with opportunity zones, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what they are, when they were created, and what they were intended to accomplish.
Absolutely. Opportunity zones, especially for listeners who haven't heard of them before, were part of the 2017 tax overhaul, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So originally proposed as the Investing in Opportunity Act, the Opportunity Zone is an economic development tool for urban and rural areas that have been designated by states and then certified by Treasury. And here's basically how they work. Individuals or entities or businesses that have capital gains from the sale of some type of property, whether it's real estate or small business, instead of paying tax on that gain, that capital gain, can invest the proceeds from the sale into a particular type of project, whether it's a business or real estate in one of these designated zones. And in exchange for doing that, the taxpayer doesn't have to pay, or in some cases doesn't have to pay any capital gains tax on that sale. So it's potentially very powerful for individuals who have capital gains, and it's 70%, or so the top 1% of taxpayers have 70% of the capital gains. So the potential beneficiaries, at least on the tax avoidance side, are folks who have capital gains. On the intended beneficiaries, however, are low-income communities. The question is, though, and really the crux of the paper, is will the benefits of this tool actually develop low-income areas? And I'm very suspicious that they will. And there are a number of other commentators have too, have expressed some misgivings also. But in the paper, I look at particularly problematic or particularly challenging subsidies or projects that are being subsidized or could be subsidized through this tool, and question, why are we giving subsidies away for projects that are already going to happen, for instance? That's sort of in a nutshell what they are and the vintage when they came about.
So why is that so attractive to the people who might take advantage of them? In other words, why might certain property owners or investors find this opportunity to avoid or defer or something relating to capital gains taxes attractive? And what kinds of potential benefits are we talking about to those individuals?
I think there's two main reasons why wealthy individuals would get excited about this. First, they don't like capital gains taxes. Politically, the folks in Congress have been pushing for the neoliberalization of tax policy to have we know about the trickle down effect. Jack Kemp and others have pushed throughout the 80s and 90s to get the federal government at least out of giving direct economic development subsidies from the federal government to places. And the Opportunity Zone is picking up on tools that have been tried before in the past. At the state level, we had state enterprise zones. At the federal level in the 1990s, we had empowerment zones. So in many ways, this is not a new tool, but it's a similar theme that focuses around this first issue of helping wealthy individuals avoid taxes. The second sort of reason that investors would get excited about this is the potential for outsized gains that the Opportunity Zone has. I present in the paper some analysis that that indicates potentially for doubling one's investment if certain criteria or requirements are met. So investors can benefit not just from buying a piece of commercial real estate or buying a business and seeing that piece of real estate or that business increase in value, but the direct subsidy from the government can double or can create, in some cases, up to 100% or around 100% increase in their investment. So that's very attractive, both the capital gains, both the avoidance of taxes, but also the appreciation or the additional benefit.
Mm. Well, so, I mean, to make it a little more specific, I mean, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how sort of the way opportunity zones would function was sort of described when the policy was proposed. Maybe a little bit about like how people have actually used it in practice, and sort of to the extent that there might be even more problematic uses, what you think those might look like and why we should be worried about them.
When the Opportunity Zone was proposed, it had and still has bipartisan support. So Senator Tim Scott in South Carolina has been a champion of it. Senator Cory Booker and others in the Democratic Party have as well. So it's important just to recognize that it has bipartisan support. And it does largely because it has something for everyone. On the conservative side, the reduction of capital gains. On the sort of more liberal or progressive side, the intended beneficiaries are low-income communities. That's the idea. The challenge, though, is really whether or not poor communities will benefit from this subsidy or this giveaway to wealthy individuals. And we have a lot of reasons to be suspicious. But I think the most important one is we don't even know, it's 2 years into the program. We don't know because we don't know that the extent of businesses or investors that are taking advantage of this subsidy because there's no reporting requirements. In the original bill, in the Investing in Opportunity Act, there were requirements that folks who were taking advantage of the subsidy had to report to the government, had to report to Treasury, to the IRS, what they were investing in, what the value was. There's been proposals to include those provisions which were taken out when the Opportunity Zone was put into the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But as it is right now, there's no requirement that investors actually report. So what we have is some voluntary reporting data, which indicates that at least for the folks who are voluntarily reporting, the investor interest is seemingly slightly lower than what the Trump administration has been touting. Secretary Mnuchin has estimated that over $100 billion, $100 billion with a B, would be invested in poor communities. What we've seen so far is closer to $8 billion through folks who are voluntarily reporting. So at least there was a lot of hype because of the potential benefits to investors. In reality, those estimates seem a little bit high, but again, we don't actually know. So without the full picture, it's difficult to say what is actually going on. So that's one of the reforms that has been proposed already in Congress by Senator Scott and others who are proponents of the Opportunity Zone is to include transparency requirements that are, I would argue, are very important or key to assessing the usefulness of this tool.
Well, to the extent we have any idea of how opportunity zones are actually being used, is there any reason to think that there are ultimately benefits that are flowing to lower income communities? And, are there concerns about like impacting the tax base, for example? And I guess one thing that really struck me about your discussion in the article, I mean, what are concerns that we might have about how people might take advantage of the way the act is currently structured in order to sort of achieve benefits for themselves without necessarily providing benefits to low-income communities?
It would be great if the Opportunity Zone does provide new economic activity in areas that need it. It would be great if I give a hypothetical at the start of the paper. An individual in Kansas is going to sell their business, and they invest the proceeds. Let's say they're going to sell their business for $10 million. Instead of just putting that money in their pocket and paying around $2 million in capital gains taxes, they take that $10 million and then invest it, let's say, in a opportunity zone in Topeka for, let's say, a mixed use residential and commercial development. That construction project will yield jobs and the additional benefits of having economic activity in a depressed area, and that's potentially important. The problem really is, looking at another instance. So in downtown Portland in Oregon, the central business district in Portland is designated an opportunity zone, not an area that's starved of capital. And what we're seeing is one particular developer is planning high-rise luxury condos on a number of parking lots that they own, that they've essentially been putting sites together for these new developments, and they're going to receive a windfall of subsidy from the opportunity zone, when in fact for business reasons they would do the project anyway. And there's this greater issue. It would be great if, or it would be important if areas that are starved of capital do receive new investment. The problem is investors are, when they're evaluating where to put their money, typically are not going to look at the most distressed financially area. They're going to look for places that are just on the margins of otherwise very economically productive areas. So metropolitan regions that already do very well are likely to receive the bulk of the investment. New York City is competing with, or Albany, where I'm based in New York State, has a number of opportunity zones. My office is based in one right now. We're competing with otherwise very built up and developed areas, like, let's say, New York City's Long Island City, where Amazon was going to locate their headquarters. If an investor is looking at investing in our area versus, let's say, New York City or Long Island City in particular, they're more likely to pick an area where the return is going to be higher. So in my research or for this article, I noticed that there were some community-based or mission-based organizations, some community development financial institutions which are certified by Treasury and have a mission-based focus to provide capital to low-income areas. Some of those organizations are getting involved in opportunity zone investing. However, there's significant disincentives for investors who have most of the cash to invest to put money into those mission-based project vehicles. So that's a big problem that hasn't been addressed by the legislation, and is a significant part of why I'm writing this piece to begin with.
Well, so Ted, in your article, you talk about opportunity zones as a form of place-based economic development. And I wonder if you could talk about opportunity zones sort of in the broader historical context of place-based economic development. In other words, what other kinds of place-based economic development tools has the government used, and which have been successful or unsuccessful in the past? And sort of, to the extent we know, like, what sort of accounts for the success or lack thereof of those kinds of economic development tools?
There are a number of other tools that have been used at both the federal and state level to develop particular places. And as a community economic development person, I direct a community economic development clinic based in New York's capital region. I get really excited about place-based economic development tools. These are the types of programs that my clients are using, or I'm training students to take advantage of and understand and appreciate. So some of the tools that have drawn comparisons to the Opportunity Zone are the Community Development Block Grant, which came about in the 1970s. The federal government allocates a certain amount of money, around $9 billion a year, to states and localities to disperse CDBG funds. The New Markets Tax Credit is probably the closest other tool to the Opportunity Zone. And again, this is similar to the Opportunity Zone. The New Markets Credit focuses on commercial developments in particular areas that are low income. The one difference with the New Markets Credit that's worth noting is that there needs to be a mission-based community development entity involved in the allocation of the New Markets Tax Credit. That would presumably require, or that requires particular types of uses that further and benefit low-income individuals. Now, there are market-based projects that do benefit from the New Markets Tax Credit. There's retail and some other types of uses that may not seem like they have an obvious connection to benefiting low-income communities. However, the requirement that there is a mission-based organization involved, I think, is important to making sure that the types of projects that are selected go through some type of vetting process and have an accountability mechanism. The question about whether or what makes place-based programs successful, and whether the Community Development Block Grant or the New Markets Tax Credit are successful, really, I think depends on the type of analysis and reporting that happens. This is an area that continues to be studied by scholars, academics, as well as practitioners. And in the research that I did for this piece, there's I think I don't know if it's a consensus, but there's an argument that certainly programs like the CDBG are understudied and the successes are underreported. The tool, the CDBG at least, could benefit from additional touting of its successes. On the New Markets Tax Credit side, there's a coalition of groups that use the New Markets Tax Credit. They publish a report discussing in great detail the types of projects as well as the benefits and successes that they have. For the Opportunity Zone, what we don't know now, and what the legislation lacks, which is a huge problem, is any assessment with respect to metrics of success. So we don't know how many jobs, at least arguably, will be created by the particular projects. We don't know how many housing units and whether there's any affordability baked into that. So this is an area that I think is ripe for focus and study, and especially in an interdisciplinary way. Economists as well as political scientists have a lot to contribute, in addition to the legal scholarship that I'm hoping this piece contributes to.
Well, so it struck me when reading the article that in order to evaluate the success of a program of this kind, we really need to know sort of what the legitimate goals of place-based economic development would be. And I mean, obviously, like something like, solving market failures is one kind of potentially legitimate goal. Maybe something like distributive justice or something like that would be a legitimate goal as well. I mean, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of what the goals of place-based economic development are or should be, and if there are ways that they might be used that might kind of conflict with what we think the legitimate goals are.
I don't think that there's shared agreement about what the goals of place-based economic development tools should be. To my mind, though, it's very clear. We have recent scholarship by folks like Richard Rothstein in the Color of Law talks about the practice of redlining and segregated housing practices, and makes the argument for de jure segregated housing practices over the in the 1900s, or especially sort of the mid 1900s and early 1900s, and programs like place-based or place-based economic development tools can and should address the harms caused by redlining and practices where potential homeowners were denied credit based on their race. And place-based economic development tools play an important role in addressing at law those types of practices. In addition, so I think that's sort of a fundamental point or fundamental goal. In addition, those communities continue to struggle following periods of urban renewal that largely led to suburbanization and white flight that sucked money certainly out of urban core areas, as well as rural areas that didn't benefit from the rise of suburbanization. So place-based economic development tools can play a role in addressing some of those wrongs. Some of the features that I talked about before that make them politically expedient or politically popular are potential incentives to particular types of communities, whether that's the rich or the communities that stand to benefit from receiving additional capital injections. But there's a lot of the details matter. I think that's the important takeaway.
Well, I mean, it struck me that maybe one of the differences between different approaches to place-based economic development is sort of like the degree to which the government is involved in a kind of active role in deciding where the investment goes. Because it sounds to me from your paper like other forms of place-based economic development maybe were a little bit more sort of kind of government directed, whereas the opportunity zone approach seems to be rather indirect in the sense that the government is sort of offering a subsidy to whoever is interested in claiming it. I mean, how do you think that affects the kind of effectiveness and the sort of function, as it were, of the program as a development tool?
Yeah, I struggle with this one a lot. I struggle sort of like more intellectually, I think, than practically, because practically, I think it's pretty simple. There needs to be community-led efforts to address economic development. So when we're talking about connecting communities to the things that they need to survive, like jobs and healthcare and transportation to get them around, and centers of education, we need to involve communities that don't have those things or need access to those things or have been denied those things because of past government programs. The problem is we can't say it's your responsibility. You have to sort of pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. That argument doesn't work. But we need to provide tools for communities to come together and direct economic development in ways that is not in ways that are not merely government coming in and saying we're going to cite this particular project here without involving the public. So there's different ways. So across the country, we're seeing trends where community groups are demanding a seat at the table, whether it's through conversations around community benefits or through community benefits agreements, or just sharing the benefits of economic development in important ways. And I think that piece is missing entirely from the opportunity zone. There's no requirement that there be involvement with the potential beneficiaries of a project. So it's the federal government outsourcing economic development to individuals who presumably know something. And this goes, I think, back to the history of opportunity zones. So Sean Parker from Napster is behind the opportunity zone. Peter Thiel bet Sean Parker $1 million that he couldn't pass it through Congress, and he did. And who knows what happened to that $1 million if they actually got invested in something or useful project. I don't know. But there's seeming reliance on the wealthy individuals in the private sector, and fear of not wanting government to play a role, while at the same time saying, picking sides and saying, look, it's this group of individuals who will benefit or who get to decide, rather than the residents who actually live in the communities where these zones were designated. And I think that's a big problem, just structurally in how the zone was created. So I think this is the fact that the opportunity zone exists is reflects this kind of struggle between community, between individuals with capital and with government to decide, to decide who decides.
Well, so I get a sense of skepticism that this sort of opportunity zone approach is really designed to be effective in achieving a lot of the sort of social policy goals that we might think are core to place-based economic development. But I wonder, to the extent that you think that there's anything potentially good about this kind of approach, what you think that might be, and what, if anything, we might do from a policy standpoint to make the opportunity zone legislation more likely to be successful in achieving those goals.
In the paper, I argue for reform, not simply elimination, although some people have argued or have proposed eliminating the zone entirely. In Congress, Representative Tlaib has introduced a bill to kill the opportunity zone. I'm not adopting that approach. I think that there is something here to salvage. I think we need to focus on three areas for reform. We need to look at the types of projects. We need to look at use. We need to look at transparency or reporting, as well as participation. So with respect to use, just letting any project get built, which is what the opportunity zone the law currently allows, does not adequately reflect the needs of poor rural and urban areas where the funds are coming in. It's not just that we need money, period. It's that communities need things like housing, healthcare centers, education facilities, and the transportation to help folks get around and access jobs. So having some type of conversation around use and including some type of mechanism to restrict use, or at least guide use to particular goals, is important. With respect to transparency, some type of reporting, currently there's none. I think having no reporting requirements, especially for something as important as an economic development subsidy, is a horrible way to judge the success of a program or a new tool. So requiring investors to report on the projects that they're doing and the particular outcomes that they have, instead of our current system of voluntary reporting, is a key aspect to any type of reform effort. And then with respect to participation, the fact that no stakeholder that there's no stakeholder opportunities or chances for individuals to or groups to get involved is a big issue. Certainly, if there's a new development, or if there's an opportunity zone investment that requires, or project that requires some type of local approval, then yeah, community groups can weigh in if there's a zoning amendment required, or if developers are trying to take advantage of an additional tax subsidy through, let's say, an industrial development agency or something like that. There is a participation mechanism, but there's no participation required through the opportunity zone itself. And I think that's a big problem. And there's easy ways to fix it. I mentioned with the New Markets Tax Credit Program involving mission-based organizations that are already certified by Treasury as having some type of mission to advance the issue, the needs of low-income communities. That would be, that's a model for legislative reform. Now, I do think there are possible benefits of the opportunity zone, and in my research, I've been looking for them and have been engaging to some extent with projects that are being reported. And I think it's important to highlight those that qualitative information about projects that do have some benefit or are having some successes. But it's also important to quantitatively assess in some way where the money is actually flowing to and what benefit it's having. Now, it's really just a word about assessment. It's really hard to determine that a particular tool, whether it's the opportunity zone or some other type of subsidy, is moving the needle in a given area, just because of the types of overlapping tools that can be used. Because there's state job creation tax credits, which was sort of the when Amazon went shopping for a second headquarters. Those were the types of, I think we heard a little bit, at least in the popular media, about the types of incentives available at the state and local level, and specifically the abuses that are ripe with respect to those subsidies. Now, just because there's overlapping subsidies, it can be difficult to say, this opportunity zone is having a greater impact than, let's say, this other state-based state-based subsidy. So there's challenges there, but not asking or not requiring investors to report at all on what they're doing, I think is a recipe for failure from the beginning. So those are that's how I think about reform, and that's what I'm advocating for with this with this scholarly intervention.
Great. Well, Ted, I really appreciate talking to you today, and I hope these observations you've made about opportunity zone legislation and place-based economic development more generally are taken up by legislators, because it seems like a important and appropriate way to think about how we might help communities that are really struggling.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. And I just I guess in closing, I'd say there are some states to look at. Oregon has introduced some state level laws to ensure that benefits are flowing to low income communities. I think there's some states that so Oregon's one example. Boulder, Colorado has initially banned opportunity zone in projects from Boulder. Recently have made opportunity zones part of the zoning process. So the city council there has said, if you're going to do a project, you have to do it in a particular area. Portland is experimenting in another way, sort of excluding the neighborhoods that could benefit and focusing development in their central business district. We'll continue to look at and research, and other folks who are writing and studying this in this area will do that too. But I appreciate you having me on and sharing some time with your listeners.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Ted.
Well, thanks, Brian.
been a dawn. I can program a computer, choose the perfect time. If you've got the inclination, I have got the crime. There's a lot of opportunities if you know where to take them, you know. There's a lot of opportunities. If there aren't, you can make them. I've got the brains, you've got the looks. Let's make lots of money. Let's make lots of single-minded, I know what I could be. How do you feel about it? Come take a walk with me. I'm looking for a partner, regardless of expense. Think about it seriously, you know it makes sense.